There we go. All right, welcome everybody, and good afternoon. I'm pretty sure it's afternoon where everybody is, unless we've got somebody, I don't know, joining us from Russia or Australia. I don't think so. My name's Kyle White. I think I'm familiar with most folks. I definitely recognize everybody's name. I'll be leading our webinar today. I'm the Director of Education here at Cooperatives First, and in that capacity, oversee our work with emerging cooperatives and manage our online learning programs, including our online courses, as well as lots of our webinars. This session is being recorded, and in the next few days, I'll share that with everybody who's signed up. Feel free to share that with your network or anybody you feel would benefit from watching this discussion. Because there's a relatively large number of us, I've asked that folks keep their microphone muted. If you have a question, there'll be time at the end for a Q&A, but you can also feel free to drop it in the chat. The chat icon is kind of in the bottom part of your Zoom window. If you ask a question there, myself or my colleague Kevin, who's joining us today, will navigate and find those later on. Speaking of the chat, let's just make sure we do know where that is. If folks want to take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, please share with us your name, the organization you work with, be it a cooperative or not, and where it is you're joining us from. The last workshop that we hosted had representation from 6 provinces and 3 countries. So let's see if we maybe get close to that sort of geographic representation again today. I also want to begin our meeting in a good way with a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to share that Cooperatives First's office and my home are located on Treaty 6 territory, which is the home of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We acknowledge that this land was not ceded, but that the purpose of the treaties was to ensure the land would be shared. Indigenous peoples have been cooperating in these territories for thousands of years, and it is through cooperation that all our communities will continue to thrive. All right, so I'll share my screen with everyone now so you can see my slide deck, and then we're going to go ahead and get into meeting minutes and record keeping, a most thrilling of topics. It actually is, because we've got a pretty good sign up for today. So I don't know, we may have to do minutes and record keeping part 2 at some point in the future. Quick overview of what we're going to cover in today's session. We're just going to do a quick getting on the same page of what we're talking about when we talk about minutes and records. We'll then spend a bit of time talking about meeting minutes, what those mean, and offering up some tips or some pitfalls to avoid. We'll then shift and talk about what you need to know about your co-op's records and record keeping in cooperatives. We'll then wrap up with some other supports and educational opportunities that we offer at Cooperatives First for folks who want to learn more or build off and learn some more about co-op governance and some of the board basics. I do have a list of 9 consolidated questions that I'll try and burn through pretty quick, and then we'll open it up for a bigger Q&A. So if you do have a question at any point throughout the work presentation, feel free to drop it in the chat. Kevin and I will circle back in the Q&A and answer all of those. But if you also want to save that for later, we'll open things up and have a good discussion. Okay, I see lots of folks are responding in the chat with introductions. I see lots of folks from Manitoba, BC, Saskatchewan. Good stuff. I see one of our colleagues here from South Africa, so I know we've got at least 2 countries represented here today, which is fabulous. Okay. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. And I want to do a quick, just a little, maybe a definition of what minutes and records are, just so we're all on the same page, talking about the same things. So what do we mean by minutes? When we're talking about minutes, there's a few things we could be referring to. We could be referring to the minutes of your annual general meeting or other members' meetings. We could be referring to special members meetings, which are called for special business. We could be referring to board minutes, which are probably the most commonly talked about and probably what we're going to be focusing on the most in today's session is board meeting minutes. We could also be talking about committee meetings. For co-ops of a certain size, they will usually create committees of the board, and those organizations take minutes for the purposes of the board. But in all cases, minutes can look a lot of different ways. They can take a lot of different shapes. But broadly speaking, they are a record of the meeting in which they were taken. And their purpose is to serve as the memory of the cooperative, ensuring that there is some sort of record of the decisions, the discussion, and the action items that were taken at the meeting in which they were recorded. Generally speaking, minutes are taken by a secretary. That may be the person who holds the office of secretary of the board, but it could also be a staff person, often executive assistant, a manager, or somebody who is paid by the cooperative, and that's one of their duties. So those are the minutes of your cooperative. The records of a cooperative is a pretty expansive term. And we're speaking here to the corporate records of the co-op. Generally, those will be housed in the cooperative's minute book. We'll unpack what goes exactly into the minute book later on. And its name is a bit misleading. There's a lot more in minutes than, or in a minute book than just meeting minutes. What's required to go into your cooperative's minute book and be maintained by the co-op is set out in co-op legislation. If you navigate to your provincial or federal Cooperatives Act and find, corporate records section, you'll find the list of records that need to be maintained by the board of directors initially and year over year. So as soon as your cooperative is incorporated, you need to open up a minute book and begin maintaining records for your cooperative. So I'll unpack what all those entail a little bit later on. So why is this important? Why are we having this conversation today? One, you have to. If you're on the board or you manage a cooperative or any organization, you have to maintain minutes for member and board meetings, and you have to maintain corporate records for any corporation. The reason for this is because a cooperative is an individual, and it has rights and obligations, and it has things that it has to uphold. However, it is also just a piece of paper. Your cooperative, doesn't exist in the world. You can't touch it per se. And so it's incumbent upon the board of directors to ensure that the co-op has its memory preserved. The reason for that is so that the cooperative can exist beyond its founding members. The reason people create cooperatives is so that they have staying power. So this generation of members will do its work and then turn things over to the next generation. And maintaining good minutes, maintaining good records will ensure that there's a seamless transition from one set of directors to the next. Records and minutes are also important because they are often reviewed by auditors or individuals or third parties that review the financials of the cooperative. Minutes are often accessed, or records and minutes are often accessed as a way of helping understand the financials and the decisions of the board and the members to explain why a cooperative did what it did and why its financial position looks the way it does. The financials are one part of the cooperative's story. The minutes and its records complete that story. And as a governance professional, I always ensure that people think about the worst case scenarios And so being sued or named in a lawsuit or having some sort of case brought against the cooperative is often a worst case scenario. And minutes and good records are absolutely essential in any sort of legal proceedings. They're going to show the decisions and discussion that were had and the judgments that were taken around any decisions that may lead to those legal proceedings. Now, we can talk a lot more about that later on. If folks have questions about what that looks like, I'm more than happy to answer those. But to protect yourself, minutes are a fantastic tool for the board to demonstrate that they have done their duty as directors and that they have exercised good judgment. As board members, we're obligated to maintain good records, as I've mentioned. In particular, your duty of care to the cooperative includes preserving the co-op's institutional memory, which means taking good minutes and ensuring that there's a good system in place for maintaining those corporate records. And as I've mentioned, the minutes can really be a tool for a cooperative. And we'll touch on this a little bit later when we talk about how much detail to go into in your meeting minutes. But really, your meeting minutes should reflect the fulfillment of your fiduciary duties as directors. I'll offer up some tips for to consider when it comes to how much detail to go into and what that means for fulfilling that duty of care. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. We've set the stage for meeting minutes and co-op records. So let's shift gears a little bit and do a bit of a deep dive into what we mean by meeting minutes, what they look like, and some important tips to take. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm just going to focus on board minutes. You have way more board meetings than you do members meetings. And for co-ops that we work with, which are usually quite youthful in nature, usually the co-ops that we work with are in the first 5 to 10 years of operating. They may or may not have committees, but they're having lots of board meetings. So just for the purpose of this, we're going to focus on board meeting minutes. And in this case, your minutes are a record of the decisions and discussion that you've had. Generally, your meeting minutes are typed. There's lots of organizations that I've come across over the years that have handwritten meeting minutes. That's fine. There's technically nothing against that. But generally speaking, they should be typed. It just, with modern standards, it's easier to access, understand, read, and share electronic files. And so your meeting minutes really should be typed. These are recorded by either the secretary, the corporate secretary, the manager, an executive assistant. It really depends on the size of your cooperative. Generally speaking, I would say once a cooperative reaches a certain revenue and level of HR, they're probably not relying on a volunteer to record meeting minutes. They're likely to rely on one of the staff members of the cooperative or a contractor. But generally speaking, it is still the responsibility of the board's secretary to oversee the maintenance, management, and recording of the co-op's minutes. In much larger cooperatives that have positions dedicated to governance, your corporate secretary may be tasked with this as well. So what do minutes look like? Generally, the style of minutes varies quite a bit. If you've seen one set of meeting minutes, you have seen one set of meeting minutes. For myself, whether I'm chairing a meeting or I'm a recording secretary, I generally start with the agenda. So I'll port the agenda's items into the document I'll be working on, and those will make up the headings that I'll work on. That may change as the meeting progresses, and it may certainly change when, the meeting has ended, and I'm cleaning up the documents. But generally speaking, if you're a secretary, I find copy and pasting the headings in your agenda is a good place to start, because then you can just hop in once discussion gets going and start taking your notes. The primary focus of minutes should be around decisions. You may want to have some sort of style guide for your board or your cooperative or your committees around what that looks like. Generally, when I'm taking minutes, I like to bold something. So if we've got a resolution, we've got a mover and a seconder, and we're making a motion, I'll usually bold that part and then, separate it a little bit from the discussion that's been had ahead of time. The same is true for an action item. A lot of the boards I work on have a greater role for board members in the work of the organization. And so action items are pretty common to be assigned to board members. So we'll often just, again, have a bolded item that says action item, Kyle will report to da-da-da and report back to the board. Something like that. Just so it's very clear what are the key takeaways when reading the minutes. It'll help directors navigate, especially if you're having longer meetings, like if you're only meeting once per quarter. It'll be easy then to parse through and find the key points. This is a complete preference, but in a follow-up where the board package is going out to directors and you send along draft meeting minutes, it might be helpful to compile the action items from the minutes into an email to directors, just so everyone's aware of the key points that we need to be working on before the next board meeting. Okay. When I reached out to folks and said, send me your questions, this was probably number one. Easily the most common question I got was, how much detail do we go into in the minutes? Do we do Cole's notes? Do we do a narrative? Do we just focus on motions and action items? Do we include last names? What do we do? And generally speaking, there is no wrong answer for how much detail you go into in your minutes. I have served on boards of directors where a 3-hour meeting will yield 2 pages of meeting minutes. And I have been on boards where a 3-hour meeting will yield 15 pages of meeting minutes. Now, if I'm to err one way or the other, I'm going to go a little bit closer to 2, but 2 is not probably not enough. But of course, this depends on the type of work that your co-op does. So here's a couple of tips I'll say to keep in mind that will inform how much detail you go into. The first is the use of individual names in the meeting minutes. Personally, I err towards not using anyone's names outside of motions. And even then, you don't really need to use people's names for making motions. Increasingly, chairs are acknowledging what the question is and simply calling the question for a vote. Lots of boards are doing away with movers and seconders. But it's a style preference, and if you want to do it, there's no harm. But when it comes to taking notes about discussion, and we're making arguments or points or discussing evidence or reports, I don't bother prescribing what someone has said to that individual. The reason for that is, regardless of what the board decides, all directors must support the decision that's taken by the board. So you may have your own individual positions, but it really doesn't matter. As a board, you have to support whatever is decided as the board as a whole. Directors can, of course, request that their dissent be recorded. And it's up to you whether or not you use names for that. That should be a discussion had at your board meeting following an AGM once to get so that everybody's on the same page and in agreement with how much use of names we use. It's up to you. The other thing is being mindful of sensitive information. A lot of questions focused on, can we include the names of employees if we're talking about something? Can we talk about, this person being owed this amount of money if they're withdrawing from the co-op or things like that? Again, it is up to you how much information you include. But the big thing I would say is directors have to be able to feel comfortable speaking freely at board meetings. If board members are concerned that something they say will make it into the meeting minutes and that that's going to cause an issue, well, then we need to have a conversation about what we capture in the minutes. Because again, if people feel that they can't speak freely around the board table, then they're not going to be able to fully fulfill their duties as directors. So what that might mean is you could move sensitive topics to an in-camera session, which I'll touch on in a little bit. We could generalize the information that was discussed. If we're talking about an HR complaint, maybe it's harassment in the workplace, you could say that a thorough discussion was held about a situation involving two employees, and it's up to you if you name them. And again, generalize the conversation without going into too much detail, but demonstrate that you had the conversation. And again, for things that you don't necessarily want to disclose in a set of minutes, you can move it to an in-camera discussion where it's only the board members and the people that they select who are privy to that information. Generally speaking, the biggest tip I would give to folks when it comes to how much detail to include in minutes is, if someone completely independent of your cooperative read the minutes, me, for example, I'm not involved with any of your co-ops, would Kyle be able to pick up your meeting minutes and by reading them, understand what you decided and why you decided it? That I would say is the biggest takeaway for any board or any secretary, as a minimum goal to look for. Would somebody who isn't us or an expert in the area be able to understand what we decided and why? Because again, in a worst case scenario, if your records are turned over to a judge who has to review them to see if you made a good judgment, will they easily be able to understand what you decided and why? That's a good test, I would say, for how much detail you should go into. And that relates back to our duty of care. Demonstrating what you decided and why demonstrates that you have taken care in your decisions and you've recorded that accordingly in the minutes. Okay, I've mentioned going in camera. Just quick show of hands or using a reaction through Zoom. How many folks regularly go in camera with their board meetings? Yeah, a couple of hands going up, a couple thumbs. Yep. One no. No, and that's perfectly fine. There's no obligation to use in-camera meetings. They are an option for directors. So just to make sure everyone's aware of what they are and we're on the same page, an in-camera session is when anyone who is not on the board of directors will generally be asked to leave a board meeting. Sometimes in-camera meetings are minuted, sometimes they're not. Usually they are used, if nothing else, to discuss the CEO's performance. They may be used to discuss a whole bunch of other things, including legal proceedings or just very contentious issues. The minutes for these meetings are optionable, but if you do take them, they can be included in any disclosure should a legal proceeding involve the cooperative. So even though you're in camera and in a secret meeting, the minutes can still be disclosed. What I would recommend if you're taking meeting minutes is you can even more brief in the detail you use for your in-camera meeting minutes. You can simply have a very high-level sentence or two about what was discussed in camera and what the board decided. That's perfectly fine. Because again, there is a general agreement that you're using your business judgment when making that call, and by virtue of doing it in camera, you're upholding a standard of confidentiality and recognizing the sensitivity of the material. So it's fine to take meeting minutes in camera, but again, try to maintain some confidentiality around that sensitive information. And should you choose to take more detailed minutes from your in-camera meetings, then I would consider, who has access to that information. Again, usually it's just the board, but oftentimes a manager or a CEO or your executive team can have access to your minute book. So just be mindful about what sort of security measures you have in place for restricting or granting access to the different types of documents. Okay, so who can access these meetings? This is probably the second most common question I received. And generally speaking, it's those who attend meetings. So if you're a member of a cooperative and you go to the AGM, you can request the minutes from that annual meeting. If you are a board member and you attend a board meeting, yeah, you can request those minutes. And even if you miss that meeting, you can request those minutes. But the biggest question I got was, do we have to disclose our board meeting minutes to our members? The answer is no, you do not. Unless the cooperative has provided in its bylaws or articles or rules of association, if you're in BC, that members may request access to board meeting minutes, then no, the cooperative is under no obligation to provide minutes to the members. The reason for this is because members of the cooperative do not owe the co-op the same duty of care as directors. Directors owe a duty of care, a duty of confidentiality, and a duty of loyalty that members simply do not share. And so it can be a detriment to share minutes beyond the board members. Most boards will allow their CEO and members of their executive team to have access to board meeting minutes. Certainly, they're going to grant in-house counsel or executive counsel access as needed. And then the cooperative's auditor will also usually be granted access to board meeting minutes. But I would recommend that the board do up a policy, especially if it's being asked, to govern who has access to the cooperative's minutes and the cooperative's records. But generally speaking, if you're being asked to provide board meeting minutes, no, you don't have to do that because they have sensitive information, they have confidential information, they have elements of business strategy that you don't want your competitors to have access to. You could be sharing them with who knows who if you share them beyond just the board. There are alternatives to sharing board meeting minutes. So should you make your minutes public? I wouldn't. I definitely would not. I have been in board meetings where we have discussed things and they have been minuted, and I would never want certain people to read those meeting minutes. And so, because members don't have a duty to the cooperative, they don't have a right to those meeting minutes. What you could do instead is if you need to provide meeting minutes to people, you can redact information. You could have things omitted from the minutes, particularly if you're talking about a staff member or an individual member. You don't want to disclose information about them and violate privacy. And maybe a safer option is you could provide a simple update. Some cooperatives do this in newsletters or in member-only sections of their newsletter. but following a board meeting, they'll post a short board update, giving them an overview of what was decided and what members should know coming out of that board meeting. That's a great way, I would say, of engaging members in the decision-making process, giving them an update about what's happening with their cooperative, while also preserving the confidentiality around sensitive information and the decisions made by directors. So what that looks like might vary depending on the size of your co-op. But yeah, a newsletter, a members only site, maybe social media if that's appropriate for your co-op. Those are all great ways of letting folks know what's happening while also maintaining confidentiality. Okay, another tip I'm going to give folks, and maybe again we'll just do a quick show of hands or a reaction, but how many folks like to take notes when they attend board meetings? Okay, couple of hands, lots of thumbs up. Okay, and just a quick follow-up. How many folks hang on to those notes? If you're taking notes during a board meeting, does that notebook, stick around for a while? Does it come home with you? Okay, mostly thumbs up as well. Okay, I would definitely recommend not doing that. Again, especially if you're in a cooperative of a certain size and you're making some decisions that, could eventually lead to a legal proceeding in the worst case scenario. The minute training that I've taken will always recommend that the corporate secretary or whoever the secretary of the meeting is, do a quick go around and collect the notes or doodles that were taken during meeting minutes, during the meeting, and dispose of them. The reason for that is every board member who take notes during a board meeting has now added their notes to the official record of the cooperative. And just as a cooperative's meeting minutes are disclosable in legal proceedings, so too are your personal meeting notes. So after I completed that course, and the person who taught that course was the corporate secretary from the Bank of Montreal. So high stakes work. After I took that course, I was very attuned to how many notes all of my peers around the board table would be taking, including my one colleague who was of a generation slightly older than my own, who had a stack this thick of notes, including notes about the terminations we've gone through and different HR things. And I just shuddered, thinking, oh no, if we ever get sued and someone has access to all of that, dear Lord, not a good thing. But yes, a good tip I would give to all board members, not just secretaries, is if you're taking notes, keep it nice and light. Post-it notes are perfect if you need just like a reminder of what you've signed up or agreed to do following a board meeting. But you want your meeting minutes to be the only official record for the cooperative. So dispose of your own personal notes at any board meeting as a tip I would recommend. And finally, if you are the secretary of the board and you are charged with taking meeting minutes, you have my sympathies. I've been in that role and it's never that fun, but it is what it is. I prefer to chair meetings, if I'm being honest with you. But things your secretary should feel very comfortable saying and things I have said many times. Hang on a second. Can you repeat that? Wait. Give your secretary some grace. Again, they're trying to type as best they can. They're usually trying to summarize discussion rather than capture things word for word. And they're trying to be a bit succinct and mindful of the sensitivities. So give your secretaries lots of grace as they try to take minutes. I would say it's also perfectly acceptable, especially if you're making a big decision or something that could have more serious consequences, for the secretary to say, hey, how does this sound? And read back what they've captured to ensure that it's reflective of the board's discussion, and it's representing what people are saying and where the discussion has gone effectively. So if you're a secretary, do not shy away from using any of those phrases to pump the brakes on proceedings to make sure that you're capturing what you need to be capturing. And when you do that, it'll also save you time afterwards. It's best to catch things in the meeting than try to repiece a discussion after the fact. So once your meeting has ended, the secretary or whoever's recording the minutes should complete a draft, share that with the board, preferably sooner rather than later, I find is best practice. Usually within 2 weeks, I think is appropriate to share with the board so they know what was discussed. But also include it with the next board meeting package as something that they know they'll need to be voting on. So they should be reviewing it. Then at that next board meeting, have a motion that approves the board meeting minutes from the past meeting. And then once that's done, file them in the co-op's minute book. One of the questions I received was, should we maintain the word draft on our minutes until they're approved? I think that's perfectly reasonable. Personally, I always just include in the title the board meeting, board meeting, date, draft. And then once it's been approved, I'll change draft to final, and then that's what gets filed in the cooperative's minute book. But that's generally how your minutes will get approved. Okay, so that's everything we've got on meeting minutes. Let's shift into some tips around record keeping. This will be a slightly shorter section. Okay, so record keeping, what records? Again, if you check out your co-op legislation, this will vary a little bit from province to province, the wording in here. But generally, we're talking about these 4 clumps of documents. The first is anything from the government. Any of your incorporating documents, amendments, any filed changes, or orders issued by the government, or any government correspondence. All of that can get filed into the co-op's meeting or the co-op's minute book. You should also maintain a registry of all the co-op's members, shareholders, if you issue investment shares, and directors. And that includes current and former individuals. You should maintain all of those records. And a spreadsheet is satisfactory for that. This doesn't need to be super fancy. A member registry can just be a list of people's names, contact information, residence, member number, if that's appropriate. It doesn't have to be a super fancy software. The minute book has to include all meeting minutes, including members' meetings, directors' meetings, committee meetings. It also needs to include all annual reports, in particular the financial reports, the balance sheet, the operations statement, and it also needs to include all annual returns and certificates of your annual return being filed, which should be a correspondence from government. It should also include any director and committee meeting minutes, including reports from those meetings, as well as policies that are then approved at those meetings. And those are all things that may need to be updated regularly. You're going to update your human resources policy or your financial policy probably every couple of years. So staying on top of what's filed in your minute book to make sure it's the most up to date is important for the secretary and management to complete. So those are the documents that you have to hang on to. There could be others. Given the work that your co-op does, you might want to hang on to contracts with other organizations. You may want to hang on to employee contracts, contractor contracts. You may want to hold on to select service agreements, insurance policy packages. There could be any number of things. If you've been through court proceedings, you may want to hold on to those. So bear in mind the work that you do as a cooperative double check your co-op legislation for the maintenance of records, and then make sure that your minute book reflects what you need to be hanging on to. So what does the co-op's minute book look like? Where does this actually live? It's not uncommon for larger organizations to still maintain paper versions. The corporate secretary for Bank of Montreal said that theirs is stored in the safe in downtown Montreal, their official minute book. I assume it's bound in gold as well. It seems so fancy. But increasingly, organizations are getting away from paper-based minute books because you're adding to them, you're changing them so frequently. An electronic version just makes more sense. There is no one software, I would say, that's far superior than any other. Most of the organizations I work with, don't have a huge budget. They don't pay their board members. We're serving on a volunteer basis. So as long as the software works, that's what matters most. So a SharePoint, a Google Drive, a Dropbox, those are all fine. As long as they have sufficient storage space for what you need, and as long as they can appropriately guard who can access the documents, that's really what we're looking for. Ideally, you'll use a platform that has sort of multi-layer access, because again, you only want some people to access board meeting minutes, but you might want more people to access your incorporating documents if they need, say, the business number or something like that for the cooperative. So be mindful of who has access to what documents, be it the board, management, leadership, probably not members. Members probably shouldn't have access. And of course, as people come and go, as people come onto the board or step off the board, you need to stay on top of who has access to those documents, which means regular password changes, and ensuring who's got the appropriate authorization to access what platforms. So be mindful of who does that. It might be worth having a record management policy for your board to ensure that you stay on top of those things, and to ensure that responsibility for overseeing this and overseeing the security and privacy of the organization has been assigned to somebody. Hey, so again, records aren't just there as paperweights. They do serve a purpose. What I'd recommend is, if your organization does something like a bylaw review or policy reviews, having a governance committee can be really helpful for that. Every couple of years, it might be worthwhile digging into your records to make sure everything is looking organized, easy to navigate, and maybe make tweaks. It might be worth updating your filing system every so often. It might be worth updating how things are titled to make sure it makes sense and is easy to navigate. And the organization just looks good. What I'd recommend is you should ask yourself, if the entire board stepped away and we had a full board turnover, could that new board get up to speed fast?
Yeah,
Would we be able to
say the
find?
jury's still out, but I think overall.
So I'm just going to mute everybody again, just to make sure we don't get any background noise. Yeah, if you have an entire board turnover, how long would it take for folks to get up to speed? Could they very quickly understand what are our current policies? What are the most recent decisions the board has made? When are our next meetings? What conventions should we be observing? And how does this organization work? They should be able to easily navigate through the co-op's records, find that information, and plunge right into the work of being a board member. And then finally, remember, the co-op's records reflect the board's fulfillment of their fiduciary duties. So do the records that we've maintained, how they're organized, how they're presented, and how someone might navigate them, does that reflect our work as a board? And the answer should be yes. You should feel comfortable with anybody new, anybody independent coming in, navigating those records and saying, yep, looks like folks are on top of it. I can understand what's happening with this organization. So that's the standard we want to aim for. Okay, that kind of brings us to the end of some of the tips. I do want to say if folks are looking for more support, more resources on some of this information, I would definitely recommend checking out our resource website, the Co-op Creator. If you navigate to the Co-op Creator and you search for anything that you're trying to work on, be it minutes, records, you'll find some sort of tool or resource or template to help you out with that. If you look up meeting minutes on the Co-op Creator, we've got some templates of board meeting minutes as well as member meeting minutes. For cooperatives in their early stages, we do offer a board basics workshop that covers kind of board governance 101, the duties of directors, taking minutes, how to organize meetings, some of those basics that folks might not be familiar with if you're new to a board or if you're new to co-ops. And then for folks who want to do a bigger plunge, we do offer an online course through our Intro to Co-ops course, where you can become a certified co-op professional. That's a free online course. I'd be happy to share the link to that course with anybody who's interested. And in my next slide, I do have a newsletter for co-op entrepreneurs that I encourage anyone to sign up for. We share lots of professional development opportunities, tools, resources, as well as a list of funding that organizations might be interested in if they're emerging cooperatives. So that's the end of my formal session. This is the a QR code to the newsletter. I'll now maybe just move into the prepared questions or the questions I had folks send me via email before we open things up for a Q&A. So one person asked, I think my biggest question is where to find the line of too much info provided versus just saying see report provided, especially when doing minutes on things like budgets. This is a great question. It's easy to just kind of take verbatim someone's oral report. If you're taking minutes, what I'd recommend is do a little bit of a combination of both. If you want to take certain highlights from someone's report, that might be worth putting into the minutes. But generally, I would also defer to see the report that was provided and include a written report with the board's meeting minutes. Another person asked, would you suggest listing the action items at the bottom of the minutes, below the meeting adjournment, or within the discussion, as I do now? I would probably note them as they come up and then probably include them maybe in an email to folks with the draft meeting minutes, just so that they're in your face. Keeping in mind who the reader is, making it easier for folks to find information is never a bad thing. Are discussions in the past meetings up to the point when a final decision is made worthy of noting in the minutes of the board meeting? In my opinion, a record of discussion could be kept so that it can be shown that the board is doing their due diligence, even though no formal motions were passed. I think that's also fine. Whenever I prepare minutes, I'll make a note or make a section dedicated to business arising from the minutes, so that if there is something, maybe an unanswered question or a resolution that has not been yet resolved, you could note it in each minute or in each set of minutes. And then once it's finally resolved, then it could be in whatever minute, whatever board meeting minutes that's taking place in. Another question. We touched on a few of these in our session. So in terms of putting draft in the heading, it's a personal preference, but usually I'll do it in the title of a document, but remove the word draft once a set of minutes have been approved. One person asked, I am wondering how to summarize a discussion to include in the minutes. Do you have to include who started the discussion, what conclusions came forth, etc.? Sometimes this is just, it's difficult to publish if the discussion is about a person or a sensitive topic. How detailed should we be? Word for word, Cole's notes, or just get the idea? Generally, I would go with the just get the idea end of that. If you're having a big, long discussion about terminating somebody, a short paragraph would probably capture it nicely. But use your judgment. Okay, I think we answered actually most of these in the session. So let's turn it over then to a more open Q&A. Let's take a look through our chat and see if there's any questions there. Hey, Janet asks, for meeting minutes, should you record who is in attendance at the meeting and who is absent? Personally, I do record who is present for a meeting. I don't usually bother with who's absent. It's up to you, I would say, depending on the size of your board. And again, primarily for board or committee meetings, that makes most sense. For a members meeting, depending on how large it is, I definitely wouldn't record who's absent because probably going to be most people. But no, I do like to record who's in attendance, but that should be sufficient, I would say. And it is good practice to demonstrate who's there for the purposes of quorum. Chris asks, how long do you want to hold on to them for? I assume you mean records. Forever. If they're digital, after maybe a couple of years, you could migrate things to an archive. I did serve on the board of a charity that was, he's 20 years old now. It's got everything in boxes in the basement. Generally, it is best practice to hang on to your records. 6 years, 7 years, I would say, is what people will commonly say as a minimum for holding on to them for. But if you're using electronic files and they're mostly PDFs, forever seems like a good, the safest possible answer. Is it possible to say all board meetings are in camera? You could. I mean, the distinction between a board that has no staff and thus nobody else is available and an in-camera board meeting is pretty small. So you could say that. As a co-op grows, I would say it is probably just practical to have people who are not board members in attendance. And you might not want them to be privy to all information. And at that point, you'd move in camera. Bill asks, should the meeting minutes be DocuSigned / or locked via PDF once completed and distributed? They don't have to be. It is up to you if you want to do that. It's certainly a personal preference around the level of security, privacy, and the fact that they are approved and certified to be so. But I wouldn't say it's necessary. Once they've been finalized and that decision's been recorded in minutes, that's usually satisfactory for having them approved. Michael asks, should it be noted in minutes if the secretary is not present and another is taking minutes for that meeting? Yeah, that's fine. I would say it's probably best practice to just note who the recording secretary is. For smaller organizations, again, that's probably going to be a board member or a volunteer. For a larger organization, that might actually change a bit. If you've got multiple EAs who are helping out with the board, that might change a little bit. So yeah, noting who the recording secretary is probably best practice. There's a very good question from Saad. Can the minutes be taken by AI notes? Yes, they can. You should definitely give them a very, very thorough going over for two reasons. One, people like me have accents and mumble sometimes. And so it might say something stupid. um, So you want to catch those. You don't want people to sound stupid in your minutes. Um, the other reason is you don't necessarily want your minutes to read like a script. Prescribing every single word to an individual comes with its own risks. And personally, I wouldn't feel super comfortable discussing some of the things I've discussed around board meetings with AI transcribing it. So if you are going to use it, I would say the secretary should consolidate anything there. So consolidate the discussion in a summary paragraph or two for each section, and then that record should be destroyed. It should be permanently deleted. So I would not necessarily rely solely on AI for the purposes of taking minutes. Okay. Looks like we've got a few more questions popped up. That's good. Ooh, someone has a different font. If a topic is discussed under one agenda item, but then brought up again later in the meeting, for example, under other business, should the minutes place it back under the original agenda item or record it where it actually came up in the flow discussion? I would probably just let things come up where they come up. There's really no harm for that. If in your work as a secretary you notice this big discrepancy or it makes it really hard to follow, you could maybe relocate something and just make a note, make a citation in your minutes and say, just for clarity on the fulfillment of this discussion, you know, this discussion was moved under this section. That would be fine. Okay, Mark asks, if a resolution was voted on electronically via email, should that decision be reiterated in the next successive meeting's minutes? And if so, in what manner? Yes. Exactly that. Um, if you, it's very common for boards to transact resolutions over email, or Teams or what have you. Very common to do that. If you do it, the best practice is then at your next board meeting, make a recording of any resolutions that were voted on over email and just have a short description about why or what the purpose was, to maybe capture any of that discussion that happened outside of the board meeting. It's up to you where those are placed. It could be a section of the agenda is dedicated to it, and then therefore a section of the minutes could be summary of past decisions or business arising from the minutes or something like that. But yeah, as long as you're recording the decision and some of the discussion that was made, that's a good use there. Using AI for minutes, we had a discussion about. Back to your points on limiting names when discussing a specific member for things like delinquency and what steps we are taking. Should we be removing those names as well, or since it's a direct risk to the co-op, keep it included? Um, it's up to you. It is a bit of a personal preference around the risk to this, because generally if a suit is going to get brought against a co-op, it doesn't matter hugely if their name is in it or not. You'll know who you're talking about if they come up in the board meeting minutes. I would say if you're talking about someone who, yeah, it's hard to say without knowing maybe the specific example of it. But I would say if you have to like place a lien against somebody, um, it's fine to include in your board meeting minutes. Because again, there should probably be a record that you've made such decisions so that again, if there is a challenge down the road, you have very clear records articulating what the board decided, why, and when. Should those minutes then be requested by somebody and you do allow for that, then yeah, you should redact information like that. You wouldn't want to violate someone's privacy by giving their name out in sensitive sense like that. Okay. So I think, regarding AI, is there also risk about the info you were feeding it and how the data is stored? When we do use it, we usually redact a lot of sensitive info. Yeah, again, if you're going to use AI, um, one, it might be worth doing a quick scan of the terms and conditions about where that's being stored, whether Google or Grammarly or whoever can share it. Um, it might be worth knowing, just for your own peace of mind and your own risk management, where that goes. But yeah, I would say anybody who's handling the minutes that are generated through AI, you're going to be putting in a lot of work anyway. Um, bringing down the level of information that's provided. I would probably still want to remove names. I wouldn't want, word for word to be in there. They're going to be editing some of the errors that AI is going to make and how it picks up people's voices. And yeah, you're probably going to want to redact some information, especially if you're sharing those minutes with anybody. So again, be mindful of the practical risks of using AI for minute taking. Should in-camera comments / results be included in board minutes? Yeah, generally. I would say if there was something of consequence that was discussed in camera, for example, if you're going to dismiss the CEO, you should probably record that somewhere. You might not want to record the entirety of your discussion, but you can simply say, discussion was had about X topic and the board resolved, this decision in camera. That's perfectly fine. That's sufficient. You don't need to go be exhaustive with that sort of information. Pat asks, do minutes in the third person, so names not used, only titles. Again, I don't usually even use titles. Um, if we're having discussion about, purchasing a new piece of land or something, I would generally just say, discussion was had about this topic and these points were brought up. This concern was raised, and then at the end, it was resolved that the board would do XYZ. I generally won't bother with names. I'll just provide a good summary of the points covered, and try and synthesize that a little bit so it's easy to read. Okay. Any other questions? If folks want to unmute, by all means, feel free to do so. If you want to continue using the chat, that's also perfectly fine. But yeah, any other questions at this point? All right. Hearing none, I think we can bring this to a close. I want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. I really appreciate your feedback, your kind words, and your questions in the chat. Stay tuned over the next few days. I'll be in touch by email with a copy of the recording and a couple of the resources that I mentioned in today's session. But thank you all so much. It was great to see you, and have a great rest of your day.